Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSet Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that we have started a series of philosophy of mind, and today we are conducting yet another lecture in the same series. In today's lecture we will talk about the concept of supervenience theory. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Without further ado, I would like to welcome sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Amrit. Hello, viewers. So, as you're already aware, we have been generally discussing different theories in philosophy of mind, and in this particular series. And as a part of that, we have already spoken about, we have already discussed various theories, especially in physicalism. As we are already aware, physicalism has been the main focus as far as philosophy of mind is concerned, and in at least as sort of it comes to us from the English speaking world. Though at the same time, if we look at Indian philosophy and if we were to glean out ideas from there on philosophy of mind, probably it'll be dominantly the ideas would be more towards idealism, not so much towards physicalism, barring probably Charvakas and maybe Sankhya. So since we haven't been discussing Indian philosophy as a part of the series, which we may do later on, here we have been mainly focusing on physicalism, and as a part of that, we have discussed already various theories starting from behaviorism. And functionalism, identity theory of mind, and eliminative physicalism. Eliminative physicalism, as we saw in the last two lectures, was a kind of a radical suggestion, which according to which we should completely do away with thinking about mental states as if they were something real, as if they really existed. So, but as we saw in our last couple of lectures, that some of the philosophers, some of the thinkers came forward and suggested that this idea would be deeply flawed, and among them is also John Searle, who apparently went on to say that if you seriously believe in eliminative physicalism, then you don't need an argument, you need a therapy. So he's vehemently opposed to such kind of radical suggestions. So now there is yet another theory which comes forward. Which is brought forward by Donald Davidson and a few others, and this is called Supervenience Theory of Mind. Supervenience is basically a relational term which suggests that if something co-varies with the if there are two things that we're talking about, and if they are related to each other by through the relationship of supervenience, then there will also be a relationship of covariance between them. So if one undergoes some changes, there will be corresponding change in the other. But the term supervenience is a little more than that. So before we start talking about supervenience theory of mind, let's try to understand what exactly is meant by supervenience. So if we look at the dictionary entry for this term, then let me quote from Webster's New International Dictionary, 3rd edition. So there it states The term supervene is rarely used outside the philosophy room these days, but it occasionally is. And when it is, it typically has a different meaning. It is typically used to mean coming or occurring as something additional, extraneous, or unexpected. That raises the question, what then is the origin of philosophical use of the term? It is not clear. Some have speculated that it originates with the British emergentists of the early part of the 20th century. So, and this is because the British emergentist Lloyd Morgan used the term supervene to characterize the relation that emergent properties bear to their base properties, and his use became fairly widespread in the literature on emergence. He held that emergent properties are distinct from and additional to their base properties and arise unpredictably from them. It was this use, not the current philosophical use, that became fairly widespread in the literature on emergence. So here we see that for the first time we find something close, this term being used, in the sense of emergence, and emergentism is still. Is still still one of the popular views, and is one of the views in philosophy of mind. And supervenience, as a matter of fact, is considered one of the variants of emergence theory. So we find the use of the term supervenience dating as back as 1923. But in philosophy, in more recent times, this word supervenience has been brought to the fore and popularized by another philosopher, namely Donald Davidson. So Donald Davidson played a key role in bringing the idea to center stage. He introduced the term supervenience into contemporary philosophy of mind in the following passage. Mental characteristics are in some sense dependent or supervenient on physical characteristics. Such supervenience might be taken to mean that there cannot be two events alike in all physical respects, but differing in some mental respect, or that an object cannot alter in some mental respect without altering in some physical respect. So the core idea of supervenience is that if there are two entities, A and B, which are related to each other through supervenience, then there cannot be an A difference without a corresponding difference in the supervenient entity, namely B here in this example. So it'll be useful for us to know both when supervenience does and does not apply. So we must understand what kind of relationship is supervenience, and when do we rightfully hold that it holds between two entities. So say, for example, the value of piece of paper, money, does not supervene on the micro features of the paper it's made out of, because the value of the money is not just determined by internal features of the paper, but also by a broader distribution of social facts and institution. The paper alone does not determine the value of money. So here we see, this example is taken from Wikipedia. So this could be a useful example to understand when the relationship holds and when it does not. So supervenience is basically an idea that some properties arise out of certain, aggregate of physical components, and such that there is some kind of a relationship, of covariance between the two entities. So, say for example, in the present case, when we talk about it, in the context of a philosophy of mind, then what we are talking about is, psychophysical. Psychophysical supervenience, which basically would mean that since mind is something that is non-physical in nature, but since it's related to the physical part, So therefore, it'll be a good idea, and we'll see the arguments later on that are proposed to sort of in favor of this idea. So it may be a good idea to believe that mind basically arises out of the physical aggregate, which is in a certain sense provides sufficient and necessary conditions for this something else to arise out of it. So even though brain or body generally speaking, because when we talk about brain, we would be limiting ourselves to central nervous system, CNS. But now there are sort of emerging findings, emerging data in neuroscience that peripheral nervous system is much more complex than we had earlier thought. So basically, what we call mind could be is something, according to supervenience theory, is something that arises out of this physical conglomerate that our body is. So when certain physical elements kind of come together in certain proportions, fulfilling the sufficient and necessary conditions, then the outcome is in a certain way mind. Though it must be clarified here that we shouldn't necessarily bring into the picture the problem of causation. So this example, this way of putting it could suggest that A causes B. The simple idea in supervenience is that some of these mental properties are supervenient upon the physical properties. So that's the broad idea. So in the example that we just discussed about the paper currency and the value it's supposed to hold, that is not something, the value of it, which is in a certain way sort of falls into the realm of abstract, non-physical, though it is in a certain way held together and controlled by the physical counterpart, namely the currency bill. So these two things are not sort of related by supervenience. So supervenience does not obtain between the value and the paper, though it does obtain between the value of the money and some larger part of the world, which includes the relevant social institutions. Some philosophical problems can be stated in terms of questions about supervenience. For example, do mental properties supervene on neural properties? Externalists in the philosophy of mind would say no, whereas internalists would say yes to that. So this way, we sort of feel it might be helpful for understand at times some value is obtained not through the relationship of supervenience, like in this example. So supervenience is a very different kind of relationship between two entities, and what it is. So supervenience is a kind of relation. It describes the way certain sorts of things are related to one another, or how they are connected. Relations are often of philosophical interest because some important concepts are fundamentally relational. For example, the concept of parent could be understood in terms of the relationship between a mother or father and their child. The items related by supervenience are usually families of properties. A family of properties is simply a group of properties of the same kind or type. A family of properties can be as large as small or small a group as we like, depending on the kinds of properties we are interested in. For instance, the color properties is a family of properties that includes the property of being orange, the property of being red, the property of being blue, and so on. So supervenience, as could be clear from this passage that has been borrowed from Neil Campbell in his book Brief Introduction to Philosophy of Mind. So supervenience is a kind of relation that holds between different families of properties. So say for example, all the different kind of colors would belong to one particular family, whereas certain other kind of properties would fall into a certain other kind of group. So to understand what a family of properties means, a family of properties is simply a group of properties of the same kind or type. A family of properties can be as large or small group as we like, as we already know. So when two families of properties are related by supervenience, we say that one set of family of properties supervenes on the other family of properties. The supervening properties are called supervenient properties, and the properties on which these supervene are variously described as the supervenience base, the supervenient properties, or just the base property. So the idea here is that there could be two set of properties, such that one is supposed to sort of supervene on the other. So one is supposed to in a certain way rely upon the other, such that if there is a change in the base, say for example in the context of philosophy of mind, if there is the physical part would be the base, because it is from there we suppose that mind has in a certain way arisen. So here the physical would be the base, body would be the base, the brain would be the base, and mind would be something that is supervenient upon it, such that if there is any change in the base, there would be necessarily or for that matter continually, we'll talk about different kinds of supervenience after a while. So there has to be some kind of a covariance, a relationship of covariance. If something changes in one set of properties, there is a corresponding change in the other set, which is supervenient upon the other. So, as a philosophical concept, supervenience was first employed in aesthetics and moral philosophy. Before we explore its use in the philosophy of mind, it would be useful to examine these earlier versions to help clarify the general concept further. So this is again most the content of what I'm reading is borrowed from Neil Campbell. So to properly understand supervenience, if we it'll be good for us to first have a look at how this idea holds in the realm of aesthetics, and also in the realm of ethics. So when we talk about aesthetics, then we know that as we already know, aesthetics is basically a term which refers to the study of the idea of beauty. Now again, the idea of beauty is something very abstract, because when we talk about beauty of something, it's mostly beauty of different artworks which are physical in nature. So say for example a painting. So if we have a painting before us and we find it beautiful, then in a certain way what we are calling beautiful is in some way depends upon the physical appearance of the painting. So if there are some changes in the structure of the painting, in colors or whatever sort of constitutes it, then our relational idea about it, namely that it's beautiful and so on, could vary. Alternatively, we could say that if there are two paintings and they are exactly look-alike. If they are sort of, if we have copy of a painting and we have a photocopy of that which looks exactly the same, or for that matter, if there are two paintings which have exactly the same color, exactly the same dimensions, everything is same, then it cannot be the case that as an observer I find one of them beautiful and one of them not, because the physical counterpart is absolutely the same. And beauty, the idea of beauty, is something that supervenes upon the physical, part of it, the physical painting that is there before us, and which we are evaluating, which we appreciate as beautiful. So the basic idea in aesthetics is that it cannot be the case that two different artworks, two different artworks are exactly the same in the way they appear in their physical constituents and dimensions, and you find one of them beautiful and one of them not. So to understand this a little bit more, let me again read from the same source. Philosophers in this field employed supervenience to describe the relationship between aesthetic and non-aesthetic properties. Aesthetic properties are evaluative properties such as being beautiful, ugly, graceful, or clumsy. Non-aesthetic properties are descriptive properties that are non-evaluative. To appreciate the difference, let's consider an example. If you look at a painting and say it is red and yellow, you simply describe it and thereby identify its descriptive properties. By contrast, if you say of the same painting that it is beautiful, you are no longer describing it, you are evaluating it as a good painting. Thus, we would say that the redness and yellowness of the painting are non-aesthetic properties, whereas its beauty is an aesthetic property. So basically here we want to learn the difference between the descriptive properties and evaluative properties, because in the domain of aesthetics we may merely describe a painting that say for example if somebody has painted say for example computer, and somebody who has never seen a computer has a look at that, so that person probably wouldn't have any evaluation of it, because that person may or may not understand what exactly the painting is about, but that person could yet describe what's painted. Namely, that there are patches of yellow here, there are patches of red there, and so on and so forth. Or maybe that person may sort of find something else in the painting to call it good or bad. But description is always possible, which is a very different kind of thing. So there are descriptive properties which merely describe certain facts about an artwork which is physical, and there may not be variance across viewers when it comes to description of it. So when a painting is described, and if there is a use of yellow color, then if I say it has a bit of yellow in it, it cannot be the case that other person would say no, there is no yellow, because descriptive properties, since they are descriptions, mere descriptions of the physical thing, cannot vary. Whereas the same painting, one viewer could find beautiful and it being an evaluative property, and somebody else may not find it, may find it in this may evaluate it in some other way. So to understand this difference between descriptive and aesthetic properties further, the descriptive properties of painting are easy to distinguish from one another and to identify. The aesthetic properties or the beauty of the painting, however, is much more elusive. Beauty is not something we can isolate and map in the way we can with redness. One cannot point to a certain part of the painting and say there is the beauty, in the way one can point to a part of the painting and say there is the color red. Furthermore, while we do not ordinarily disagree about the color of some part of a painting, we often disagree about whether or not a painting is beautiful. although aesthetic properties are clearly quite different from the non-aesthetic properties, it is clear that what makes a painting beautiful or ugly is the collection and organization of its non-aesthetic properties. The aesthetic properties of a work of art depend on and are determined by its non-aesthetic properties. So here we see that there is some kind of sort of juxtaposition between the physical constituents that go into the making of a painting, and the evaluative part of it. According to which, following which we call something beautiful, ugly, and then so on and so forth. So there is, but there is a certain reason for us. We may find a certain reason for to say that aesthetic properties of a work of art depend on and are determined by its non-aesthetic properties, because as suggested earlier, if there is some change in the physical part, then then the evaluative part may vary. So certainly beauty is something in a certain way that is supervenient upon the physical counterpart of it. Beauty is something in aesthetics which in a certain way arises out of the physical counterpart and supervenes upon it. So now another important thing for us to understand here is that supervenience is not reductionism, because say for example if we recall our identity theory, according to which mental states could almost could be sort of just seen as their physical counterpart. So such that we could all hold them identical. There is no difference between the two. So that kind of that involves certain kind of reductionism, but supervenience is different from such kind of attempts to theorize the relationship between the mental states and the brain states. And to understand why supervenience should not be considered as reductionism, we must understand what is the meaning of reductionism. So, in reductionism, reduction of one class of entities to another is understood as involving the identification of the reduced entities with the reducing entities. There are times when one is justified in understanding reduction instead as the elimination of the reduced entities in favor of the reducing entities. And this is from this definition is from Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So here, as we saw in reductionism, the two properties are identified, and one of them could even be eliminated. The way in which the beauty of art, the beauty of a work of art, depends on its non-aesthetic properties is a very complex matter. Although it is clear that aesthetic properties depend on non-aesthetic properties, it seems very implausible to suggest that aesthetic properties could be reduced to non-aesthetic properties. So, from this we can understand that supervenience, though supervenience involves the idea of covariance and the idea of some kind of the relationship holding, inevitable relationship holding between the physical part of the physical part, namely body, and the supervenient part, namely mind, but it does not involve the kind of reductionism that we just talked about. So even in the area of aesthetics, we cannot say that that aesthetic properties could be reduced to non-aesthetic properties, even though they depend on and they are determined by the non-aesthetic properties. So there are two reasons, with us to believe that supervenience does not involve reductionism. What are these two reasons? And there are at least two reasons for this. In classical versions of reductionism, the bridge laws connecting two theories not only were supposed to allow us to reduce the phenomena of one theory to the phenomena of more fundamental theory, but also to deduce or predict higher level phenomena from lower level phenomena. For example, the bridge laws connecting cellular biology and chemistry were supposed to allow us to predict cellular phenomena from knowledge of chemical phenomena. So similarly, one reason for being skeptical of the idea of reducing aesthetic to non-aesthetic properties is that there don't appear to be laws connecting aesthetic and non-aesthetic properties that would enable us to reduce the aesthetic properties of a work of art from knowledge of its non-aesthetic properties. Our aesthetic experiences are simply not like this. We do not observe the non-aesthetic properties of a painting and then, using a set of rules, conclude that the painting is beautiful. The fact that a painting is beautiful is not something that we work out or calculate on the basis of other facts. If there were rules about which non-aesthetic properties give rise to aesthetic properties, presumably there wouldn't be so many terrible paintings in the world. For creating a good painting would simply be a matter of following the appropriate rules. So one of the reasons why we don't hold that there is this relationship for reductionism is that there are no laws operating between non-aesthetic and aesthetic properties on the basis of which we could say that given these descriptive properties of this work, it has to be considered as aesthetically beautiful or otherwise. So friends, we'll talk further about this. We'll continue our lecture. We'll return after a short break. Thank you. Hello, welcome back, viewers. So, as we were talking about, as we were discussing that supervenience is not a type of reductionism, and we saw that one reason, at least as far as aesthetics is concerned, is that there is no set, there is no clear set of rules which would describe this relationship between the descriptive non-aesthetic properties and the aesthetic properties. So unlike laws of sort of this kind of connection in biology, say for example, so given certain descriptive facts, if these facts obtain, then according to certain laws, something else would definitely emerge out of that. So such kind of necessary kind of relationship, necessary sort of ways of certain laws of obtaining beauty from non-aesthetic properties. Those laws are not defined in aesthetics, so there may not be this kind of a strict necessary relationship between the two. And the second reason why we should be skeptical about the idea is that one can reduce aesthetic to non-aesthetic properties is similar to the reason for being skeptical about reducing mental types to physical types. Just as the same kind of mental state can exist in creatures that are physically different, the same aesthetic properties can be supported by radically different non-aesthetic properties. For example, paintings, sculptures, and symphonies have radically different non-aesthetic properties and yet can share the same aesthetic properties, since they can all be beautiful. In light of this fact, one might say that aesthetic properties are multiply realizable, for they can be realized by a wide array of non-aesthetic properties. So again, this example is as I stated earlier, the content of most of the slides is borrowed from Neil Campbell. So this example also comes from him. Another reason for us to hold that this relationship between aesthetic and non-aesthetic properties is supervenience, and which is very different from reductionism, is that beauty is something that could be that could have different material causes. So paintings could be beautiful, so could be sculptures. So beauty as a property could arise from the medium could be different, and medium of course is physical, because beauty would manifest itself through some physical medium. So therefore, medium could be different. Medium could be simply music, sound. Could be three-dimensional, stone sculptures. It could be two-dimensional paintings, and so on and so forth. As we have already seen, multiple realizability is a serious obstacle to reduction. And in the same way here also, since beauty or aesthetic properties could be multiply realizable from different physical counterparts, so supervenience, as we think, holds between aesthetics and non-aesthetic properties, is therefore not reduction. The fact that aesthetic properties all seem to be multiple realizable appears to raise the same obstacle to attempts to reduce aesthetic to non-aesthetic properties. It seems that aesthetic properties depend on non-aesthetic properties but cannot be reduced to them. Philosophers introduce the term supervenience to describe this relationship and to contrast it with reduction. So this relationship between aesthetic and non-aesthetic properties, is the relationship between them is not that of reduction. It's not that we are reducing the aesthetic properties to their physical counterpart. And as we saw that there are various reasons for that. So therefore, since this relationship is not that of reduction, therefore there has to be another term to define that. And supervenience, was one such term which philosophers introduced to describe this relationship between aesthetic and non-aesthetic properties. To contrast it with reduction. So now to sort of sum it up, as far as aesthetics is concerned, the idea of supervenience in aesthetics is that since the aesthetic properties of a work of art depend on its non-aesthetic properties, any two works of art with the same descriptive properties must have the same aesthetic value. Thus, if two paintings are indistinguishable, they must be equally beautiful or ugly. It is impossible for them to differ in their aesthetic properties if they have the same descriptive properties. Supervenience in aesthetics, then, is a concept designed to capture three ideas about the relationship between aesthetic and non-aesthetic properties. And what are these three ideas? One, aesthetic properties depend on non-aesthetic properties. Second, aesthetic properties cannot be reduced to non-aesthetic properties. Third, the relation between aesthetic and non-aesthetic properties holds consistently across individual works of art. So there has to be some kind of a consistency. As pointed out in this example, if descriptive properties of two two paintings are exactly the same, then it cannot be the case for a given observer to say that one of them is beautiful and the other is not. So there has to be consistency across individual works of art. So this was broadly how supervenience obtains in works of art between between what we call beauty and what it supervenes upon, what it arises out of. So in a certain way it physically depends and is determined by the physical content, but at the same time it's much more than that, and therefore it cannot be reduced to its physical counterpart. Now, before we move on to philosophy of mind, it'll be very useful for us to understand the same idea in the realm of ethics. It'll make things very convenient for us to understand when it comes to philosophy of mind. So, as far as supervenience in ethics is concerned, ethics is the philosophical study of morally right, as we are already aware, and wrong behavior. It's morally right and wrong behavior. The study of that is called aesthetics. In this regard, supervenience might be a useful way to understand the relationship between moral and non-moral properties. A moral properties like beauty in aesthetics, and evaluative properties such as the property of being good, honorable, or evil. Non-moral properties are similar to the non-aesthetic properties we discussed earlier. They are not evaluative but are descriptive. So say for example, somebody in a queue, somebody offers space to some senior citizen. So though in a certain way, if I were to describe it, purely from the description point of view, somebody would say, well, the person A allowed the person B, who's a senior citizen, to go ahead of him in the queue, to go ahead of her in the queue. So that is, a mere description of what actually has happened in a given scenario. Whereas, somebody could evaluate this act as good or kind or generous or morally good. So which is a very different kind of thing to do. So mere description, doesn't involve any kind of evaluation. It merely describes the certain facts to be so and so. Whereas the moral properties, arise out of a moral evaluation of, those physical, facts, so to speak, those physical acts, rather, so to speak. So, despite the fact that moral properties are not empirically observable, most philosophers believe that they depend on non-moral properties. That is, although goodness or badness is not a property we can identify alongside the descriptive properties that make up a person's actions, it nevertheless seems clear that a person's moral properties depend on the actions they perform. There is a good reason to think that although moral properties depend on non-moral properties, the former cannot be reduced to the latter, since former seems to be often in excess of the latter. So the idea here again, as stated, moral properties first of all are different from descriptive properties, because you cannot, sort of describe them exactly where they are. So you cannot say just like in painting, you cannot say that, see, this is the dot in the painting where actually the beauty resides. If you take it away and the beauty goes. So it's the overall thing that is beautiful. And the idea of beauty arises out of appreciation of a work of art. It's a result of appreciation of a work of art, which is kind of mental operation. So similarly in the realm of ethics, a mere fact about a particular act does not have any moral properties, to be described. So say for example, the example that I just stated, if somebody allows a senior citizen to go ahead of her in the queue, there is nothing in the act itself where we could point out that, see, this is this is the fact that sort of makes it morally correct. It's out of evaluation. It's out of moral evaluation that we find that this act is tantamount to kindness, is tantamount to being having a good sense of being civil, and so on and so forth. So it's a similar kind of situation in ethics, that there are certain sort of descriptive properties and there are certain moral properties, and those descriptive properties seem to be necessary for something to be called as good or bad or whatever. But at the same time, the two are different, and moral properties in a certain way supervene upon the descriptive properties, and the two couldn't be reduced to each other. So another reason for this is that, like beauty, goodness also seems to be multiply realizable. So why it's not a reduction is because goodness also could be multiply realizable. We can easily imagine that Anna and Shabana are both good human beings, even though they have performed different actions. Even if they do some of the same things, it is easy to suppose that they don't perform them in exactly the same way. So even if a same action is performed by two different individuals, there could be two different reasons for that, which would and if we are aware of those facts, then our evaluation about those two acts descriptively looking same could be different. While at the same time, since there could be, say for example, if we talk about some moral property like being kind, then it could be multiply realizable. So in the sense that if you help, say for example, render help to anybody in a certain way, you would be sort of called kind. If you find somebody in a difficult situation, which could be which could differ from instance to instance, then one could think of you as a kind person. So it's multiply realizable. So one could sort of take example of Kantian ethics also here, that even if the same at times same action is performed by two different people with two different motives, then our moral evaluation, if those motives are known, then those two different actions would be evaluated differently by us. So therefore, the same moral property could be obtained through different instances, physical instances, and also the other of it could also be the same, or vice versa. So the possibility of two individuals with the same moral properties but different non-moral properties appears to preclude the possibility of reducing the former to latter. But what shall we say of two people who have all the same descriptive properties? If Anna and Shabana had all the same descriptive properties in common, that is, they do all the same things in the same way, then in light of the claim that moral properties depend on non-moral properties, we would have to say that Anna or Shabana, or it could be any other name, are either both good or both bad. It would be impossible for one of them to be good and for the other to be bad. Thus, just as two identical paintings cannot differ with respect to their aesthetic properties, two people performing the same actions cannot differ with respect to their moral properties. But from the point of view of supervenience, one of the presuppositions that we hold is that if the descriptive properties are exactly the same, then it cannot be the case that our moral evaluation of it will have to be different. So unlike the theory which we just stated, which sort of through which we prove that supervenience is not a kind of supervenience, but one of the presuppositions in supervenience which allows us to hold that supervenience, the relationship of supervenience holds between descriptive properties and moral properties, is that if descriptive properties are exactly the same about two individuals, which may or may not include the motives they might have, which otherwise makes it relevant for us to have a Kantian moral evaluation of it. So that may or may not be a part of descriptive properties. But if descriptive properties are exactly the same, then it cannot be the case that we call we evaluate one of those descriptive properties in one way, say for example as a kind action, as a good action, and another in another way. So just like in aesthetics, the broad idea here is that if descriptive properties are all alike in two different cases, then our moral evaluation of them has to be the same. So to capture all of these ideas about how moral properties are related to non-moral properties, philosophers have proposed that moral properties supervene on non-moral properties. In this case, the moral properties make up the supervenient family and non-moral properties constitute the supervenience base. Thus, in ethics, we see the concept of supervenience was used to capture three ideas that are exactly analogous to the ones in aesthetics. Number one, moral properties are depend on non-moral properties. Moral properties cannot be reduced to non-moral properties. The relation between moral and non-moral properties holds consistently across individual moral agents. So it's just like in aesthetics, and this is again borrowed from Neil Campbell. So these are the three fundamental presuppositions when we talk about supervenience, whether in the area of aesthetics or in the area of morality. Now, having looked at how supervenience is taken into consideration in aesthetics and in ethics, we can now glean out the broad sort of formal contours of what supervenience involves. Broadly. So if we abstract from our specific examples of supervenience relations in aesthetics and ethics, we see that as a general kind of relation, supervenience describes a relationship between two families of properties of the following kind. Number one, supervenient properties depend on base properties, physical properties that is. Supervenient properties cannot be reduced to base properties, so it's not reductionism. This clause is there basically to preclude reductionism. And third, the relationship between supervenient and base properties holds consistently across individuals. So as we saw, the third condition in both the cases, if physical properties, say for example non-aesthetic properties in the case of aesthetics and descriptive properties in the case of ethics, are exactly the same in two instances, then the supervenient properties could not differ. So as I pointed out earlier, if the two paintings look exactly the same and have the same dimension, we cannot call one of them as beautiful and the other as ugly. Similarly, if descriptive properties of two actions are exactly the same, which may or may not include motives, then it cannot be the case that one of them we would call as morally good and the other as morally bad. So this is the broad idea. These three properties, namely that of dependence, that is supervenient properties depend on base properties, that is physical properties, and the idea of non-reduction, that supervenient properties cannot be reduced to base properties. That's the second condition. And the third condition, which is that there has to be a kind of a consistency. Supervenient and the base property should hold consistently across the individuals, across the instances. So these are the three broad essential conditions which define, which make the relationship between something physical, namely base properties, and something non-physical that seems to result from it, namely something abstract, which could be which could the supervenient properties could differ depending on whether we are talking about aesthetics, ethics, or mind, but there has to be consistency across the instances. So the general kind of relation, so supervenience. Now let's move on to supervenience in philosophy of mind. So as far as philosophy of mind is concerned, supervenience seems to satisfy two needs philosophers thought were required for a plausible theory of mind. The first need was for a non-reductive theory, which is the second condition that we had just mentioned. Because supervenience denies that supervenient properties could be reduced to base properties, it seemed to fit the bill admirably. The second need was to express a form of physicalism despite the denial of reduction. Some philosophers began to think that the best way to achieve this was not by denying the existence of non-physical states, but by claiming that the mental depends on the physical. This falls short of the more robust forms of physicalism, such as eliminative materialism or the identity theory, but remains a form of materialism nevertheless, because it claims that the physical facts in the world determine all the facts, including all the mental facts. Since supervenience expresses a form of dependence as well as anti-reductionism, supervenience looked very appealing indeed. So, as far as philosophy of mind is concerned, supervenience seems to be, a good way to go along for philosophers who are contemplating upon this relationship between mind and body. Because it does not, involve any kind of reductionism, and at the same time, it allows for certain kind of some kind of physicalism not to be violated. So we are able to keep the idea of physicalism intact without getting into any form of reductionism, which some other theories earlier involved, which includes identity theory of mind and even eliminative physicalism in a certain sense. So the idea of supervenience seems to solve some of the issues that we discovered in some of these earlier theories. So, since supervenience describes a relationship between families of properties, adopting this relation for use in philosophy of mind meant changing the focus from talk about mental states or events to talk about mental properties, such as property of being a belief or property of being painful. The proposal then was the mental properties supervene on physical properties. This is known as psychophysical supervenience. So here, instead of talking about mental episodes, mental events, and so on and so forth, we just consider, what we had been hitherto calling mental events, mental episodes. We just look at them in terms of properties, as if these belong, these what we have been calling mental events were, some kind of properties which were related to something else. And then, having considered them as properties, we could try and explore the relationship between these properties and what these properties are properties of, and what kind of relationship between holds between these two different set of properties. So this is the broad change, broad shift that we find in supervenience theory of mind from some of the earlier ways of theorizing about the same thing earlier than supervenience. So friends, we'll stop our discussion on supervenience here today, and then we'll talk more about this in our next lecture. Thank you.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Ajay Verma for coming here and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.